All right, welcome to your personalized deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we are going to take a look at hooks
Okay.
in React, and we're looking at episode 8, hooks, revolutionizing functional components
Right.
of unraveling React internals, a great video series. And we're going to be talking about why they're such a game changer.
Absolutely. They're a big shift in how we think about React.
Yeah. So maybe we should start by talking about, like, what was the problem that hooks were trying to solve?
Yeah. So before hooks, React was primarily built using class components.
Yeah.
And those were, they were pretty powerful.
Right.
But they had some challenges. They could get really complex, especially as your application grew.
Yeah, and I know that I've had a lot of problems with them in the past. So what were some of those challenges that you're talking about?
One of the biggest ones was something called prop drilling.
Prop drilling.
Prop drilling. So imagine you have data like at the top level of your application.
Yeah.
And you need to pass that data down to like a deeply nested component.
Way down at the bottom.
With class components, you had to kind of manually pass that data through each layer of the component tree.
So every single component in between.
Exactly. And it could get really messy.
Yeah, that does sound messy.
And then there were lifecycle methods.
Okay.
Which were methods that were called at different stages of a component's life.
So like when it mounts or when it updates.
Yeah. And those could get really cluttered with logic.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be hard to kind of separate concerns and make your code reusable.
Okay, so it sounds like class components, while they worked,
Yeah.
they had some inherent complexities to them.
Yeah, they were definitely a bit more verbose,
Mm-hmm.
and they had a steeper learning curve.
Right.
And then functional components came along,
Okay.
and they were like a breath of fresh air.
Okay, so functional components. So how do functional components, how are they different from class components?
So functional components are basically just JavaScript functions
Okay.
that take in data called props,
Right.
and then they return what should be displayed on the screen.
JSX.
Exactly. They're much simpler. They're easier to read.
Right.
And they're more testable.
Okay,
So it was like this big shift towards like, simpler, more functional style of programming.
I see. And so that's where hooks come into play, because functional components sound great,
Yeah.
but they also sound limited. So how do hooks expand on that?
Exactly. Yeah. So hooks came along as a way to kind of give functional components more power.
Oh,
right. So they allowed you to hook into like all the core features of React.
Okay, so the features that you would normally use with class components?
Exactly. Like state management,
Okay.
side effects,
Yeah.
context,
Yeah.
all of that stuff. But you could do it from within a function.
Okay, cool. So let's dive into some of the specific hooks that you mentioned. So you talked about state management, and you brought up useState. Can you tell me a little bit about useState and how that works?
Yeah. So useState is like the most fundamental hook.
Okay.
And it's used for managing state within a functional component.
So state, just to be clear, state is any data in your application that might change over time.
Exactly. So if you have like a counter
Okay.
or a form
Yeah.
or anything that needs to, update based on user interaction,
Right.
you would use useState for that. And it's super simple to use. You just call useState with an initial value, and it gives you back two things: the current value of the state and a function to update the state.
Okay.
And every time you update the state using that function, the component re-renders to reflect the new state.
I see.
It's really elegant.
It does sound elegant. It's a lot easier than having to manage all of that yourself.
Absolutely.
Cool. So what about useEffect? You mentioned useEffect as well. What's that all about?
So useEffect is for managing side effects.
Side effects.
Side effects. And a
Yeah.
side effect is basically anything that happens outside the scope of your component.
Okay.
So like fetching data from an API.
Right.
Or setting up a timer.
Okay.
Or interacting with like the browser's DOM directly.
Okay, I see. So anything that kind of reaches outside of the component itself.
Exactly. And useEffect lets you perform these side effects in a controlled way.
I see.
So you can specify when you want the side effect to run,
Okay.
like, when the component mounts,
Right.
or when a certain piece of state changes.
Okay.
And you can also specify how to clean up after the side effect.
Oh, okay. That's more.
Like if you set up a timer, you want to make sure you clear that timer when the component unmounts.
Right.
Otherwise, you might end up with memory leaks.
Yeah.
So useEffect is really powerful for managing, the more complex parts of your application.
So those are two big ones. useState, useEffect. There are more built-in hooks, right?
Yeah, there are a bunch of other built-in hooks, like use context for accessing the React context.
Okay.
Use ref for creating references to DOM elements.
Right.
Use callback and use memo for performance optimization.
Yeah, we don't even have to get into those. We can
Yeah.
those are fun ones to explore, but those are the more advanced ones.
Yeah, we can do a whole deep dive on those another time.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, so we've talked about the built-in hooks, but one of the really cool things about hooks is the ability to create your own custom hooks, right?
Yes, that's where the real power comes in.
Yeah.
With custom hooks, you can essentially abstract away complex logic into reusable functions.
Okay.
So let's say you have, a piece of logic that you need to use in multiple components.
Right.
Like, a function for fetching data from an API.
All right.
Or a function for handling form validation.
Right.
You can encapsulate all of that logic into a custom hook.
I see.
And then you can just reuse that hook in any component where you need that functionality.
So it's really about code reusability and keeping your code DRY.
Exactly, yeah. Don't repeat yourself.
Don't repeat yourself.
It makes your code much more maintainable and less error-prone.
Okay, so when you're creating these custom hooks, are there any like best practices or things that you should keep in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most important things is naming. You want to give your custom hooks really clear, descriptive names
Okay.
so that it's immediately obvious what they do.
Right.
Another thing is to keep them focused.
Okay.
So a custom hook should really do one thing well.
Yeah.
Don't try to cram too much logic into a single hook.
Right.
And then another thing is to be mindful of performance.
Okay.
So you don't want your custom hooks to cause unnecessary re-renders.
Yeah, that was something that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. So, just be careful with how you're using state and effects within your custom hooks.
Okay. So it sounds like custom hooks are a really powerful tool.
Yeah, they're really game changers.
But you gotta use them wisely. You gotta use them responsibly.
Totally.
So, we've talked a lot about the benefits of hooks, but I'm wondering, for someone who's listening to this and maybe they're not a developer,
Okay.
why should they care about hooks? What's the impact on like the end user experience?
That's a great question. So even if you're not a developer, hooks actually have a big impact on the user experience.
Okay.
Because they allow developers to create, more performant, more efficient applications.
Okay, so faster, smoother.
Exactly. Yeah. And also, more maintainable applications.
Okay.
Which means that, developers can spend less time fixing bugs.
Right.
And more time adding new features.
And new features are what users want.
Exactly. So it's a win-win for everyone.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. So even though you might not see hooks directly, if you're using a website or an app that's built with React and is using hooks, chances are it's going to be a better experience for you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like, the engine under the hood of a car.
Right.
You don't necessarily see it,
Right.
but it makes a big difference in how the car performs.
Exactly. So we've gone on this deep dive. We've gone from these kind of clunky class components to these sleek new functional components with these amazing hooks that really give them more power.
Yeah.
What's the takeaway here? What do you want people to remember about hooks?
I think the main takeaway is that hooks have really revolutionized the way we build React applications.
Okay.
They've made our code more concise, more reusable,
Right.
more testable,
Right.
and they've also made it easier for us to manage complex logic.
Okay.
So, if you're a developer who's working with React, hooks are definitely something you should be using.
Right.
And if you're not a developer, just know that hooks are making the apps and websites you use every day better.
Yeah. And so I guess my final question for everyone listening is, if you were building an app, what kind of custom hook could you create to solve a problem? What kind of custom hook could you create to make something work better?
That's a great question to ponder. The possibilities are endless.
Yeah. It's really exciting stuff. It really is.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It was a pleasure being here.
All right, see ya.
See ya.